They said the war would change everything, but no one expected it to change the taste of bread. People forgot what real sugar smelled like, forgot the sweetness of morning tea, forgot the comfort of a full stomach. By 1942, the cities of Europe and Asia had turned into silent queues and hungry faces, lines stretching outside ration shops under gray skies, where every person waited for food that ran out long before their place in line was reached. It was in these long, desperate lines that the shadows quietly took root, shadows of the black market, the hidden world beneath the war, where survival was bought not with ration coupons but with risk, luck, and sometimes blood. The official records of wartime seldom mention this underground network, yet everyone living through the occupation knew that the black market wasn't simply a criminal problem, it was a lifeline, a heartbeat beneath the debris. Newspapers blamed smugglers for scarcity, governments issued warnings, posters threatened punishment, but behind every closed door, behind every boarded window, behind every dim alley, the truth was far more complicated. In occupied France, in the alleys of Warsaw, in the ruins of Shanghai, in the villages of Burma, illegal trade became the quiet rebellion of the starving. People who had never broken a rule in their lives suddenly found themselves bargaining with strangers, sneaking past soldiers, hiding food beneath clothes and beneath fear itself. A story whispered through the streets of Lyon perfectly captured this strange new reality. A baker, once known for his honest smile, had been caught selling bread made with stolen flour. His customers' mothers, elderly men, hungry children had known the risk as much as he did. Yet the shock wasn't that he had broken the law, the shock was that someone had reported him. "Who would betray the only man giving us real bread?" they murmured in the blackout evenings. No one asked why he did it. Everyone knew why. Honest work no longer fed families, survival no longer followed rules. Across the continent, in Warsaw, the situation was even more severe. The German occupation had turned the city into a maze of fear. Official rations for Polish civilians were so low that even a healthy adult could not survive on them. The ghettos were worse, ration levels were calculated to bring slow death. Under such cruelty, children as young as 8 learned to slip through cracks in the walls, carrying potatoes, onions, or a few pieces of bread pressed tightly against their ribs. Soldiers sometimes looked the other way, other times they didn't. A single mistake could mean a body in the street by morning. Yet the smuggling continued, because it had to. If the black market stops, one survivor remembered, the city dies within 3 days. On the other side of the world, in Japanese-occupied Asia, the same desperation produced different faces but the same fear. In the narrow lanes of Rangoon and the markets of Manila, Japanese regulations tightened around food, fuel, cloth, and medicine. Rice, the food that had once been taken for granted, became precious enough to spark fights in the street. Rumors spread of villages hiding reserves underground, of farmers selling grain secretly at night, of fishermen keeping some of their catch away from official inspectors. Opium, fuel, and ammunition also traveled through hidden routes, some used by resistance fighters, some by ordinary families who simply needed money or food. The borders between patriotism, survival, and crime blurred until they were nearly invisible. What made this underground world even more complicated was the involvement of soldiers themselves. German soldiers on the Eastern Front traded cigarettes for bread. Japanese soldiers, underpaid and short on supplies, sometimes exchanged medicine for rice. Even Allied soldiers, stationed far from home, occasionally dipped into unofficial exchanges, fuel for chocolate, medical equipment for fresh eggs. The war pushed everyone into moral gray zones. In these shadow markets, the question was rarely, is this right, but will this keep us alive? Yet the black market was not only about hunger. It was a quiet form of resistance. In France, members of the resistance depended on smugglers to move radios, weapons, and false papers. In occupied Holland, fishermen risked execution by hiding Jewish families in the storage compartments of their boats. In Shanghai, Chinese workers bribed guards to send information to underground anti-Japanese groups. Illegal trade carried not just food but hope of survival, hope of rebellion, hope that power still existed in the hands of ordinary people. Governments and occupying forces responded with increasing brutality. Posters warned, "Black marketers are traitors." Patrols raided houses at night, searching for hidden sacks of flour or rice. In Berlin, special courts sentenced black market dealers to death. In Tokyo, newspapers printed the names of arrested smugglers as a public warning. Yet the crackdowns never stopped the trade, they only pushed it deeper into the shadows. The more the authorities tried to control people's hunger, the stronger the underground networks became. The black market thrived not despite the war but because of it. There was a strange rhythm to these hidden economies. At dusk, when the blackout curtains fell, whispers began. A knock on a back door. A quiet signal exchanged in a dim hallway. A bicycle parked suspiciously near a deserted barn. A woman clutching a basket too tightly, walking too quickly, eyes darting at each soldier she passed. A man slipping into an alley to meet a stranger whose name he would never know. The war had created a world where trust became currency, and fear became the border both sides understood. Official newspapers would never print stories like these. They would speak of heroic battles, patriotic sacrifice, and economic unity. But below those headlines, real life flowed through unofficial channels: illegal, dangerous, necessary. What historians would later call black market activity was not simply crime, it was the story of ordinary people trapped between two impossible choices: obey and starve, or break the rules and survive. It was the story of soldiers who looked the other way because they, too, understood hunger. It was the story of families who risked everything for a single meal. It was the story of a world where war turned ethics upside down and survival became the only law that mattered. And for many, it was only the beginning. The invisible roads of the occupied world. The black market did not grow in the open, it grew in silence, in footsteps, in the careful movement of people carrying things they were never meant to hold. By the middle years of the war, an entire network of hidden roads had formed, paths that didn't exist on any map, but that millions of people knew by instinct. These were not highways or train lines but routes of whispers, stretching through forests, across fields, under bridges, behind abandoned houses. They were created not by governments but by fear and necessity, and though no one could see them, these invisible roads became the real arteries of the occupied world. It often started with a single person. Someone who knew a farmer willing to sell a bit of grain. Someone who knew a soldier who didn't ask too many questions. Someone who had an aunt living near the border who could hide things in her cellar. From these fragile beginnings, entire corridors of secret movement emerged. They carried bread, salt, onions, medicine, batteries, matches, cloth, soap, small things that meant everything. A kilogram of wheat could travel 50 miles without ever being seen in daylight. A bar of soap might pass through 6 hands before reaching the person who needed it. Every movement was a link in a chain held together not by laws, but by trust that could break at any moment. In occupied Belgium, people spoke about the night lanes, dirt paths through the countryside that peasants used to move goods quietly between villages. These routes looked completely ordinary by day, but at night they became highways of life. Farmers, school teachers, and even priests walked for hours with baskets strapped under their coats. They didn't speak while traveling, words could be heard. They didn't carry lanterns, light could mean death. Only footsteps and breathing guided them, along with the faint smell of wheat or potatoes hidden beneath layers of cloth. Similar roads formed in Greece, where German blockades had caused horrific famine. Islands that once exchanged food freely suddenly relied on fishermen making perilous midnight journeys in tiny boats, slipping through patrol lines with silent oars. The Aegean Sea, sparkling blue in times of peace, transformed into a vast shadow where one misstep could lead to gunfire. Yet every night, boats kept leaving, because families on the mainland were starving and no blockade could stop the ocean from becoming a lifeline. But the most intricate illegal routes appeared in Asia. There, the geography of the war was different: thick forests, mountains, rivers, and colonial borders that had suddenly become military frontiers. In the jungles of Burma, villagers created hidden trails through bamboo thickets that even Japanese patrols struggled to navigate. These trails connected hamlets to resistance camps, and resistance camps to small towns, forming an underground network that moved rice in one direction and information in the other. A farmer might carry a basket of rice to a distant hut and return with a slip of paper containing troop movements or railway schedules. The same path that saved a soldier also fed a hungry family. Shanghai's illegal trade developed even more creatively. Under occupation, the city was a patchwork of foreign concessions, Japanese-controlled zones, refugee districts, and pockets of Chinese resistance. Ordinary citizens learned to navigate this complicated map the way smugglers learned to navigate labyrinths. Tailors hid messages in jacket linings, rickshaw pullers transported eggs beneath false floors, and street vendors passed medicine under piles of dried fish. These weren't criminals in the usual sense, they were people using their professions as camouflage. A fruit seller might be selling oranges at noon and delivering radio parts by dusk. The invisible roads did not belong only to the desperate, they also belonged to the bold. In France and Holland, smugglers developed techniques that blurred the line between cunning and artistry. Some used hollow bicycle frames to hide documents. Some built secret compartments in horse-drawn carts. One Dutch family even constructed false walls in their home so goods could pass from one basement to another without ever crossing the street. Every invention was an answer to the enemy's surveillance, a small victory carved out of danger. Yet none of these routes could function without one crucial human quality: risk shared becomes courage. A single person carrying flour was a criminal, a group of people each carrying a handful of flour were a movement. The war turned strangers into partners. People who might never have greeted each other in normal times suddenly found themselves relying on one another for survival. A fisherman trusted a baker. A farmer trusted a schoolgirl. A widow trusted a teenager she barely knew. The invisible roads were built on these fragile but powerful connections. Authorities, naturally, tried to break these networks. Patrols increased. Roads were blocked. Random inspections became routine. Landmines were placed along forest paths. Soldiers questioned anyone walking alone at night. Yet each new restriction only forced the networks to adapt. If roads were blocked, smugglers moved through fields. If fields were patrolled, they took to rivers. If rivers were watched, they slipped through city drains or used rooftops. The underground world was fluid, adjusting faster than any occupying force could anticipate. Sometimes, however, the danger caught up. A checkpoint appeared on a path that had been safe for months. A patrol changed its route without warning. A soldier recognized a suspicious pattern. And then suddenly, a family would wake in the night to the sound of boots, torches, shouts, and the crash of a door being forced open. The war never allowed these networks to exist peacefully. But even when one route collapsed, another quietly opened elsewhere. Hunger made sure of that. What truly defined these invisible roads was not the goods they carried but the stories they held. Stories of a grandmother in Kiev who walked 20 miles to deliver milk to a family she had never met. Stories of a monk in Nanjing who smuggled quinine to fever-stricken children. Stories of a teenage boy in Normandy who guided strangers across a field while enemy planes droned overhead. These were not grand wartime myths, they were quiet acts of human endurance, performed without expectation of reward or recognition. No headline ever captured the courage of these paths. No military report ever listed the names of the people who walked them. Yet without these invisible roads, the occupied world would have collapsed far sooner. They formed a shadow infrastructure that kept millions alive long enough to witness the war's end. And as the conflict deepened, the roads only grew more intricate because where there is desperation, there is movement, and where there is movement, there is hope. Faces behind the forbidden trade. Long before the war ended, people realized something unsettling: you could understand a city merely by watching who bought and sold in its shadows. If the invisible roads were the arteries of wartime survival, then the people who used them were its beating heart, ordinary faces twisted by extraordinary times. The black market was never an empty system, it was built by human hands, shaped by human fear, and carried forward by human hope. To walk into this hidden world was to discover a society running parallel to the official one, governed not by politicians but by the quiet decisions individuals made every day. You could start with someone like Elena, a young widow in the outskirts of Naples. Before the war, she sold vegetables from a small stall inherited from her father. But when food shortages spread and the official markets emptied, Elena's stall turned useless overnight. The customers kept coming, mothers clutching ration cards, children with tin buckets, but she had nothing left to offer. So, like many others, she looked for another way. Her brother-in-law knew a farmer outside the city willing to sell potatoes without paperwork. A neighbor's cousin had a contact who brought flour from the countryside at night. Slowly, reluctantly, Elena joined the trading web. She didn't call it illegal. She called it filling stomachs. By the time German soldiers occupied Naples, Elena was no longer a simple vendor, she had become a quiet operator in a network that fed hundreds. Not because she wanted profit, but because she could not stand the sound of children crying from hunger. In contrast, there were men like Kaito in Tokyo, opportunists who thrived in chaos. Kaito owned a small warehouse before the war, importing textiles from other Asian countries. When the conflict intensified, the import routes collapsed, but the demand for cloth and warm clothing skyrocketed. Instead of bowing to fate, he embraced the darkness. He bribed a guard at the harbor. He purchased fabric smuggled from Korea. He hired boys to deliver small bundles wrapped in newspaper. Within months, Kaito's warehouse became a hub of underground deals, moving everything from stolen ration stamps to Japanese cigarettes intended for soldiers. He told himself he was simply running a business. Others called him a thief who fed off scarcity. But in war, morality often depended on perspective, and Kaito's buyers didn't question his methods, they only cared about surviving winter. Then there were stories like Yusuf's, a fisherman on the coast of Java. His boat was old, his livelihood modest, and the Japanese occupation had forced fishermen to surrender most of their catch to the authorities. But families in the villages were starving, and Yusuf could not bear the idea of tossing his extra fish into military baskets. So he kept a portion hidden beneath false wooden planks in the bottom of his boat. At dusk, he quietly delivered these fish to a network of women who distributed them among the sick and elderly. Sometimes soldiers inspected the boats, their flashlights sweeping the waves like knives of white light. Yusuf's heart thudded against his ribs each time, knowing one wrong move could cost him everything. Yet he continued. Not because he saw himself as a hero, but because war had reduced survival to such fragile acts that even a single fish carried meaning. In Warsaw, the faces took on different expressions, sharper, thinner, marked by the brutal hand of occupation. There, the black market was not a side economy, it was the only economy many could rely on. One could follow someone like David, a boy of just 12. He learned, not from school books but from alleyways, how to slip through broken ghetto walls and move between guard patrols. His pockets never carried money, they carried risks: 2 onions, a handful of bread crumbs, a few coins wrapped in cloth. His mother would wait every evening, standing by the window with trembling fingers, praying that his footsteps would return before dark. David didn't think of himself as a smuggler. He thought of himself as his family's last chance. For him, the black market was neither crime nor courage. It was necessity woven into childhood. Across the continent in Paris, the shadows were slightly brighter but no less dangerous. Cafe owners hid sacks of illegal coffee in basements. Tailors stitched cloth bought from secret dealers. Even policemen, underpaid and hungry, sometimes allowed a small transaction to pass if it spared them another dinner of watery soup. The faces in Paris were diverse: students, barbers, school teachers, doormen, all participating in a system that they pretended not to notice. A handshake here, a quiet nod there, a paper bag exchanged beneath a table. The city hummed with forbidden trade, a rhythm the occupying forces could sense but never fully stop. Asia added more complexity to this human mosaic. In Manila, 2 sisters named Rosa and Milagros used their flower stall as a cover. By day, they sold garlands to soldiers and civilians. By night, under the smell of jasmine, they moved antibiotics and bandages to underground hospitals. The sisters had no medical training, no political ambitions. They were simply reacting to the growing number of wounded people who staggered into their neighborhood seeking help. The black market gave them access to materials the hospitals could no longer obtain legally. Every evening, as they wove flowers into delicate strands, they also wove pathways of healing through a wounded city. Some faces in this world did not belong to civilians at all but to soldiers. An American private stationed in North Africa might trade canned meat for eggs. A German corporal in Ukraine might swap cigarettes for milk. A Japanese officer in Malaya might secretly exchange medicine for rice. None of them would admit it openly, yet the war had bent their principles. Their uniforms represented authority, but their hunger represented humanity. And hunger often spoke louder. Yet for all these people, the widows, the opportunists, the fishermen, the children, the shopkeepers, the soldiers, the black market carried one universal truth: it demanded silence. Deals happened behind shutters, beneath blankets, in basements that smelled of damp and secrecy. People learned to speak in coded phrases. They adopted neutral expressions. They walked with the calmness of those who understood that fear must never show on their face. Every person who entered this hidden world became an actor in a silent theater, performing roles shaped by necessity. What tied all these faces together was not greed, nor defiance, but a quiet acceptance of responsibility. Each person carried the weight of someone else's survival. A farmer saved a family. A child saved his mother. A trader saved a stranger. And in this way, the black market became something larger than an economy. It became a human chain passing life from one hand to another, even as the world around them fell apart. And as the war dragged on, These individuals, whether reluctant participants or determined opportunists, found themselves facing choices that would shape not just their futures, but the very moral fabric of their societies. The price of survival. War had a way of redefining value. In the occupied cities and villages of Europe and Asia, currency became meaningless in the face of hunger, fear, and scarcity. A loaf of bread could cost a month's ration card, a single egg might demand the careful surrender of a precious cloth, and yet people paid these prices without hesitation. The underground world of the black market was no longer merely a place to find what governments denied. It became a system where survival had its own cost, one that was measured not just in goods, but in risk, secrecy, and human life. By 1943, reports from occupied territories noted an astonishing rise in informal trading. A mother in Lille might offer a pair of shoes for a handful of potatoes, a barber in Warsaw might exchange his razor for a tin of milk. What outsiders saw as crime, those living under occupation understood as the currency of life. And yet, every transaction carried peril. Soldiers patrolled streets with rifles slung across their shoulders, looking for anyone who dared to move outside the official system. Neighbors reported each other for fear of punishment. Informants, whether motivated by money, ideology, or survival, created an atmosphere of mistrust. In such times, the true price of survival was not the rationed food itself, but the constant balancing of risk and reward. In the rural outskirts of France, entire families became part of covered supply chains. Fathers smuggled flour over miles of dirt paths, mothers hid sugar and salt beneath floorboards, and children ran messages between households. The cost of a misstep was severe: confiscation, imprisonment, or worse. But the rewards, too, were tangible. A child with bread in hand could go to sleep without hunger gnawing at their stomach. A family with flour could bake more than just bread, they could preserve hope. These informal networks functioned on trust, honor, and reputation, each transaction reinforcing the invisible rules that kept the system alive. In Asia, the stakes were even more intricate. Japanese occupation forces in cities like Manila or Rangoon imposed severe restrictions, and villagers who attempted to bypass them faced violent repercussions. A fisherman transporting rice could be shot on sight, a trader moving medicine might be arrested and executed. Yet, necessity bred ingenuity. Hidden compartments in boats, false bottoms in baskets, even decoy deliveries became routine. One man might make 3 journeys in a single night, each time risking his life, knowing that the lives of entire families depended on his success. Here, survival wasn't a personal act, it was a communal responsibility. The black market's human cost was not only in physical danger but in moral compromise. Ordinary citizens often had to make impossible choices. A shopkeeper might sell flour at an inflated price to a wealthy customer while giving a smaller portion for free to a starving neighbor. A soldier might pocket a few extra rationed items, knowing that withholding them from civilians could mean their death. These choices blurred the line between right and wrong. In normal times, such actions might have been condemned, but in wartime, the calculus of survival rendered ethics relative. People who had once lived by strict rules found themselves navigating a moral labyrinth with no clear exit. Yet the black market was not entirely selfish. In many cases, it became a vehicle for resistance. Secret traders funneled supplies to underground movements, hidden hospitals, and refugee shelters. Bread, sugar, and clothing were exchanged for intelligence, maps, or safe passage. Networks of ordinary people became lifelines for those targeted by occupying forces. In Burma, clandestine trails through forests not only transported rice but also messages detailing troop movements. In Warsaw, hidden caches of food and medicine helped sustain resistance fighters for weeks at a time. Here, survival intersected with defiance, creating a complex economy where the value of a single potato extended far beyond its nutritional content. The social fabric of these underground networks was fragile. Trust was essential, but suspicion was constant. Betrayal could come from anywhere: a neighbor jealous of another family's small success, a collaborator looking for personal gain, or even an exhausted family member desperate enough to turn in someone for a sack of flour. Stories abound of families who survived the war only to lose everything after a single misstep in trust. And yet, for every betrayal, there were countless acts of selflessness that went unnoticed. People shared food, guided strangers, or took risks that endangered their own lives, all in the quiet pursuit of keeping others alive. The black market was, paradoxically, both a test of humanity and a testament to it. Economic impact was also undeniable. The prices of black market goods often far exceeded official valuations, creating wealth for some and deepening desperation for others. In Paris, certain merchants became quasi-legends, known for their daring exchanges of sugar, coffee, and flour. In Manila, the same could be said of small-scale traders who ran networks supplying everything from vegetables to medicines. But wealth came at a cost. Visibility attracted attention, and visibility could be deadly. The very success of a black market operator made them a target, forcing them to constantly innovate, hide, and adapt. Every gain carried a risk that could erase it in an instant. Beyond the economic and social dimensions, the black market reshaped culture and human behavior. People developed new languages of trade signals, nods, coded words, and secret meeting points. Children became couriers, learning routes and patterns that the adults depended upon. Entire neighborhoods coordinated movements to avoid detection. Meals became collective ventures, families pooling food, neighbors splitting rations, networks improvising recipes based on what was available. Hunger dictated creativity, fear dictated discretion, and survival dictated everything else. By 1945, as the war drew to its cataclysmic close, the black market's legacy became clear. It had fed millions, defied regimes, and shaped the moral contours of entire communities. It left behind stories of courage, cunning, and compromise that would later be recounted in memoirs, history books, and oral testimonies. More than that, it revealed a fundamental truth about humanity: when formal systems collapse, people find ways to sustain life, even if those ways exist in the shadows. Survival had its price, but it also had its rewards. The black market, once condemned as illegal and immoral, was revealed to be essential. Its participants, children, widows, soldiers, traders, were not just criminals or opportunists, they were actors in a complex drama where hunger, fear, courage, and morality collided. They navigated invisible roads, forged fragile alliances, and made impossible decisions, all to keep life moving forward. In a world dominated by occupation, violence, and scarcity, the black market was more than a system of trade, it was a system of life. And so, the story of wartime survival concluded not with grand battles or formal treaties, but with quiet acts of risk, trust, and human ingenuity. People had learned to trade not merely for profit, but for hope, not merely for sustenance, but for the preservation of life itself. It was an economy where courage had currency, compassion was capital, and the cost of survival was measured in choices that no one would ever forget.